Something happened this week that almost nobody saw coming. Iran launched drones at the heart of Saudi Arabia's oil empire. And instead of sitting back and absorbing the blow like the world expected, the Saudis did something that could change the entire direction of this war. So let's break down exactly what happened, why it matters, and, most critically, where all of this is headed next. Let's start with the trigger. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated, large-scale military strikes against Iran in an operation Israel called Roaring Lion and the U.S. named Operation Epic Fury. The target list was specific: nuclear facilities, military infrastructure, and Iran's leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. Several top security commanders were wiped out in the same strikes. Hundreds of people died inside Iran in the opening hours alone. Tehran declared 40 days of national mourning. And then, Iran hit back, hard, and it hit everything. Within hours, Iranian ballistic missiles and drones were in the air across the entire Gulf region, not just toward Israel, but aimed at Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and U.S. military assets stationed across all of them. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps called these attacks their first powerful steps. But here's what made this particular wave of retaliation different from anything we've seen before. For the first time in history, all 6 Gulf Cooperation Council states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman, were simultaneously targeted by the same actor within a 24-hour window. A researcher at Qatar University's Gulf Studies Center called it their long-standing nightmare scenario and said plainly, it has now happened. Now, in the middle of all this chaos, one target grabbed global headlines more than almost any other: Saudi Aramco's Ras Tanura refinery. Ras Tanura is not just any oil facility. It is Saudi Arabia's largest domestic oil refinery, processing over 550,000 barrels per day. It sits on the kingdom's Gulf Coast and serves as one of the most critical export terminals for Saudi crude in the entire world. Saudi Aramco, the company that operates it, has a market capitalization exceeding $1.7 trillion and controls roughly 12% of all global oil production. When drones fly at Ras Tanura, the world's energy markets do not simply shrug. On March 2, 2026, 2 Iranian drones came for that refinery. The Saudi Defense Ministry confirmed both were intercepted before reaching the facility. But that's where the story gets complicated. Even successfully intercepted drones leave behind debris, hot, fast-moving metal fragments raining down on an active oil complex. That debris sparked a fire. Thick black smoke poured into the sky over the Gulf Coast, visible on satellite imagery released by Vanter and picked up by news agencies worldwide. The footage was devastating PR for the kingdom, regardless of whether the drones were technically stopped. Saudi Aramco made a decision: shut it down, halt operations, review export routes. The refinery that Saudi Arabia depends on to keep the lights on was taken offline as a precaution. An official source said there was no impact on domestic petroleum supply, but the signal that went out to global markets was unmistakable. Oil prices surged. Brent crude jumped roughly 10% in a single day. West Texas Intermediate, which had been trading around $67 a barrel on Friday, hit approximately $72 by Monday morning. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which around 20% of global oil consumption flows, had already ground to near halt after tankers were attacked nearby. The Palau-flagged oil tanker Skylight was set ablaze off the Musandam Peninsula of Oman. Another vessel, the Marshall Islands-flagged MKD Viam, was also targeted. 150 freight ships stalled. Qatar's Qatar Energy, the world's largest LNG producer, halted production after Iranian strikes hit its facilities in Ras Laffan and Mesaid, sending global gas prices to a 3-year high. The economic damage from this wave of strikes was not hypothetical. It was real, and it was happening in real time. Then came March 4th, and the plot thickened considerably. The Aramco refinery at Ras Tanura was hit again. According to multiple sources cited by Reuters, a projectile struck the facility directly for the second time. This was not debris from an interception. Something got through. That second strike pushed Saudi Arabia into a decision that no one was quite prepared for. Here is what the Saudi government had said publicly up to that point. Its foreign ministry issued a statement condemning the Iranian attacks as flagrant and cowardly, said the strikes had been repelled, and then added a line that defense analysts flagged immediately. The kingdom affirmed it would take all necessary measures to defend its security and protect its territory, citizens, and residents, including with the option of responding to the aggression. That last phrase, including with the option of responding, is diplomatic language for something real. Saudi Arabia was not closing the door on a military strike of its own. And then the jets moved. Defense analysts tracking the region noticed Saudi air assets being repositioned. Saudi Arabia dispersed military aircraft, hardened critical infrastructure, activated alternate command and control nodes, and implemented civil defense measures, including shelter-in-place alerts, school closures, and controlled public movement, all consistent with a military preparing to do more than just absorb incoming fire. A senior defense analyst at Breaking Defense said it plainly: "If Iranian attacks continue throughout this week, I would expect the Gulf Arab states to eventually participate in counterattacks on Iran. The UAE in particular would be one to watch for this, but so too might Saudi Arabia. They need to restore some kind of deterrence against the Iranians, and sitting passively by and using up their air defenses won't accomplish that." The Saudi cabinet released a statement saying it would take all necessary measures to defend the kingdom. And here's the detail that ties everything together. According to reporting by The Telegraph and The Washington Post, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had already conducted multiple phone calls with President Trump before the war even began, reportedly urging him to strike Iran and warning that Tehran would become stronger and more dangerous if Washington did not act immediately. MBS didn't just watch this war start from a distance. He had a hand in shaping the conditions that led to it. That makes his kingdom's next move not just a reaction, it makes it a continuation. France, meanwhile, made its own crossing. French Rafale jets were scrambled to shoot down Iranian drones targeting the UAE, where hundreds of French military personnel are stationed. The French foreign minister confirmed it publicly. France has now fired in anger in this war. The UK gave permission for the US to use British bases for defensive strikes. The E3, the UK, France, and Germany, jointly resolved to back proportionate military defensive measures against Iranian drones and ballistic missiles. This war is no longer just a US-Israel operation. It has drawn in the Gulf and is pulling in Europe. So what happens next? This is where serious analysts diverge, and it's worth laying out the realistic scenarios clearly. The first trajectory, and the one most Western governments are quietly hoping for, is a negotiated pause. Iran has lost its supreme leader. Its nuclear sites have sustained confirmed damage, with the IAEA reporting that the Natanz enrichment facility showed some recent damage. Iran's military command structure has been decapitated. From a purely rational standpoint, continuing a war that is killing hundreds of Iranians per day against a coalition armed with what Trump described as a virtually unlimited supply of munitions is not sustainable. Satellite photos showed limited activity at Iranian nuclear sites, and analysts suggested Tehran was likely assessing the damage and salvaging what remained. A ceasefire window could open, but it requires someone in Tehran willing and able to negotiate. Who that person is right now remains deeply unclear. The second scenario, the one keeping defense ministries awake, is that Saudi Arabia formally enters the conflict. If Ras Tanura gets hit a third time, or if water desalination plants or power grids are targeted, what analysts have specifically named the real nightmare scenario, the calculus changes entirely. Without functioning desalination infrastructure in one of the world's driest and hottest regions, Gulf cities become uninhabitable. At that point, Saudi neutrality is not a political choice anymore. It becomes impossible. And a Saudi strike on Iran, potentially coordinated through the GCC's Unified Military Command, would represent the most significant escalation of this conflict yet. Not because Saudi Arabia's air force is the decisive factor militarily, but because it would signal to the entire Arab world that the regional order has permanently shifted. The third scenario involves the Strait of Hormuz fully closing. Iran has not yet officially mined the strait or blockaded it outright, but the attacks on tankers and the stalling of 150 ships suggest it could move in that direction. A formal closure of the Strait of Hormuz would be a global economic event of a magnitude that hasn't been seen since the 1973 oil embargo. 20% of global oil and a significant portion of the world's LNG passed through that choke point. The knock-on effects for Asian economies dependent on Gulf energy, for European markets already rattled, for inflation in the United States would be enormous. Trump has already said this could last 4 to 5 weeks. Energy economists are not so optimistic. For news professionals and analysts watching this develop, the storyline that will dominate the next 72 hours is Saudi Arabia's decision threshold. Every press conference from Riyadh is being parsed for language shifts. Every satellite image of Saudi air bases is being examined for signs of offensive rather than defensive posture. The joint statement signed by the US, Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE condemning Iran's indiscriminate and reckless attacks was notable. It was released through the US State Department, which means Washington is actively coordinating with Riyadh on the diplomatic messaging. That coordination doesn't end at press releases. The other storyline is succession inside Iran. Trump said publicly that most of the people we had in mind to lead Iran were already dead. Iranian clerics were reported to be wary of naming Mojtaba Khamenei, the deceased supreme leader's son, as a successor, precisely because he would be an even more high-profile target. With no clear leader, Iran's chain of command for its missile and drone campaign is operating under enormous stress. Whether that leads to de-escalation or to rogue units continuing strikes without central authorization is one of the most dangerous unknowns in this entire situation. Here is the bottom line for anyone trying to understand where this is going. A week ago, this was a US-Israel operation with Gulf states nervously watching from the sidelines. Today, every Gulf capital has been struck. Aramco's crown jewel refinery has been hit twice. A French fighter jet has fired in combat over the UAE. Saudi Arabia has publicly reserved the right to retaliate. Oil markets are in genuine distress, and the man in Washington says he's prepared to go far longer than 4 weeks. The line nobody expected Saudi Arabia to cross, the line from passive defense to something much more deliberate, is no longer a hypothetical. The jets are positioned. The statements are drafted. The only question still hanging in the air is whether Riyadh decides this week that enough is enough, or whether it waits for one more strike to make that decision for them. Stay close to this story, because the next 48 hours could change the answer entirely.